Welcome to Current Affairs. My name is Nathan Robinson. I'm the editor-in-chief of Current Affairs, a magazine. Returning to the program today is Tara Isabella Burton. She is a novelist and a nonfiction writer. She is the author of the novels Social Creature, The World Cannot Give, and the forthcoming book Here in Avalon, available next year. She's also the author of the nonfiction books Strange Rites, New Religions for a Godless World, which we discussed during her last appearance on the program. And most recently, SelfMade, creating our identities from Da Vinci to the Kardashians, which was previewed a little bit a couple of years ago in Current Affairs, the wonderful article that Tara contributed called Making of the Self-Made Man. So, Tara Isabella Burton, thank you for returning to Current Affairs. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be back.
Your new book profiles many eclectic figures, from the guy who painted himself looking like Jesus during the Renaissance, to the Andy Warhol superstars, to, as you say, the Kardashians, and the guy who made the Whole Earth catalog, and Oscar Wilde, and dandies, and Thomas Edison. Let me ask you first, what is it that unites all of the figures that you profile from chapter to chapter under this single unifying framework?
So it's not just that they're successful self-makers, which is to say either that they are people who come from situations of economic either deprivation or mediocrity and become wealthy, nor is it exclusively that they live their lives as a work of art, although many do. What unites these sort of two disparate groups is their conviction that basically we are able to shape our own selves in a sort of deep way, that who we are is what we want to be. And the inner work and the work of managing perception of others all works together to kind of fulfill the most human of purposes, which is to quote the Renaissance humanist Pico della Mirandola, fashion ourselves. What being human means is deciding who we are. And this ideology, explicit and implicit in various writings of these figures or works of these figures or in the lives of these figures, they are all very much participating in that vision.
It's funny because when you said that what unites them is kind of this conviction that we decide who we are, we can make who we are, I feel as if this idea has wormed itself so deeply into our thinking today. I can imagine people hearing you say this and thinking, what's so strange about that? In a way, what you're doing with this book is you're taking what seems obvious and trying to make it seem unfamiliar to us again. I want to ask you, what is the alternative? What preceded this view? If not the view that we make ourselves, is it the view that the world makes us? What does this view that you're describing depart from?
I'm a theologian, so I see everything as a theological problem. And I think the departure we're looking at is the idea that we are made by God. In particular, this is a book about the West, primarily. It is a book about the transition between the medieval and Renaissance Europe. So it is a book specifically about Orthodox Christian Catholic theology and its recession from the public sphere. Obviously, any generalization is reductionist, but roughly speaking, I think we can talk about a pre-modern, pre-Renaissance vision of the self, that we are created in the image of likeness of God, but we are created by God. And what that means is that we are part of creation. Everything that is part of a unified, meaningful whole, where our purpose, whether it's the knowledge and love of God, or it is expressing the glory of God, our purpose is not for ourselves, but for some greater end. And this is what links a human being to a plant, to an animal, to a river, is that we tend towards something, and that something is outside ourselves. And ultimately, our emotional state or our inner lives is something that, if it is to be cultivated, it is to be cultivated and conformed in pursuit of virtue or in pursuit of saintliness, so that we might better fit ourselves to the purpose outside us. And roughly speaking, we start a little bit in the Renaissance. This really gathers steam in the European Enlightenment. But this idea that our purpose is outside us, and also that our kind of role in the social order is part of creation. This is, I think, a really big distinction that we see around Enlightenment thought, which is the idea that our social roles as neighbor, as prince, as king, what have you, as peasant, that this is somehow part of who we really are. It is part of creation. It is part of what we are meant to be. It may not be the totality of it, but it says something about us. And then the sort of big dirty word in the in the Enlightenment becomes this idea of custom, that our social lives, our social imaginaries are not fixed. They're not God-given. They're just kind of random. And this is something that gets explored in a variety of ways. One of the most popular genres of exploring this is the traveler's tale. So either visitors from the so-called New World or from the Far East who come to Europe or vice versa are theorized by French writers. I'm thinking of Diderot, I'm thinking of Montesquieu, Persian letters, and others. But then there's this sort of whole genre that's people looking at the way things are done in Europe or elsewhere and going, gosh, this is so weird. There's a funny man in a magic hat who says he can turn wine into blood. That's so crazy. And what's sort of being done constantly throughout this genre of writing is trying to conceive of social life and relational social life as just kind of arbitrary and subject to change. It's just custom. Therefore, it doesn't have any real weight. And the question that comes out of this then is, well, all right, what does have weight? What matters? Or to put it really simply, what makes us us? And increasingly, the bit of us that makes us us, rather than the bit of us that the world puts on or ascribes to us or demands of us, is our internal states, our psychological reality, and ultimately, I argue, our desires. What we want is seen as more constitutive of who we really are than our social place, our familial role, or things that are in the sort of post-Enlightenment mind, broadly speaking, thrust upon us by society rather than being organic and innate to our selfhood.
Yeah, so I guess it wouldn't occur to us to look at plants and all of the other animals and think that they could be self-made, that they could will themselves into, being whatever they wanted to be. And up until the point that you're describing, human beings sort of accepted that we were one piece of existence and had pretty limited control over who we are. Because, as you say, we are not creators. There is a creator, and we are created, and we are the stuff that was made, not the stuff that does the making. But once you start to think of yourself as capable of doing the making yourself, it's immensely liberating, because you can start to, and I think throughout you kind of treat this as not wholly good or bad. It's very mixed, because on the one hand, if you start to think of yourself as having the godlike power to determine who you are, and tradition is just custom, then you can have faith in kind of fixing injustices. You would go, okay, well, we can have the kind of society that we want. We have to think about, who are we? What do we want? But on the other hand, as you point out, it can sort of lead towards the idea of the fascist Superman.
Absolutely. It absolutely leads there. Or more broadly, I think it leads towards a vision of the most human is the human who self-creates. That there is a kind of degree to which we... And I think that this is a sort of implicit cultural assumption now that is rarely stated explicitly like this, but is sort of the underpinning of every kind of be your best self, self-actualization, self-care, doing the work language that's just like the miasma that we breathe, culturally speaking. And it's that, the thing that makes us human is our humaning. We human to a greater and lesser extent. And therefore, there's a kind of the act of self-creation and this kind of willful decision to be who we want to be, think we are, and manifest that is the benchmark of how good we are at this whole human thing. And so people who cannot or will not, for whatever reason, and I think different historical eras have different conceptions of exactly what those other non-self-maker people are doing, But those who do not appear to be self-making in the mold of either a Grimes or an Elon Musk, either the entrepreneur or the pop star celebrity, that they're somehow failing or lesser, whether it's because they don't innately have it. The mysterious quality that self-makers have is so hard to define that half of the language we have for it is messy, like je ne sais quoi, or the English using bon ton, which is the English people using French, because maybe if it's in French,
it's true. It's insightful and true.
Yeah, like we can get past the fact that no one knows what it means.
Yeah.
Or, of course, in old Hollywood, it, in quotation marks. So
it.
that mysterious quality, it might be innate, and therefore some people are just worse because they don't have it.
Yeah.
Or it's willed or a matter of hard work, and some people are not focusing enough. And I believe that ultimately, by the 20th century, the kind of innateness model and the hard work model converge somewhere around the time of old Hollywood, I would say. And we get this sort of basically a theology of desire. That the thing that means that you are a self-maker is that you want it badly enough. And that desire is constitutive of being a special kind of hungry person.
You know, I'm supposed to go later this afternoon on to, I don't know why I agreed to this, but I agree to pretty much anything, onto a right-wing talk show in Britain to debate or argue with someone who is a very firm believer in, like, I think we're debating manfluencers, and they believe very strongly that they're, you know, in this alpha male, beta male category. And they believe, I was reading the writings of the person I'm supposed to debate, you know, that there's the alpha male who is the guy who is the self-making guy. And the more you are in control, the more of a man that you are. Whereas the weak passive men, they allow themselves to be influenced rather than doing the influence. And there are this sort of, you know, you are more of what you ought to be to the degree that you yourself are able to control others rather than just floating through life like a leaf in the wind.
I find manfluencers fascinating.
I bet.
What interests me about them, I think, and this is perhaps the most, I'll try and be extra charitable here, that there's precisely this tension between this vision of a kind of pre-modern existence that's about hierarchy and dominance hierarchies. And if we could just, and I'm paraphrasing here, get back out of, now that democracy and equality have kind of eroded these natural distinctions between people, everything is confused, and we would like to return to a time where there was meaningfulness. And this is the kind of, I feel like there's a version of this that is the through a glass darkly version of an argument that I make in terms of seeing a difference between the modern and pre-modern vision of the self, although I want to be clear that I do not think it is the unmitigated tragedy that they do. That said, I think that what's really interesting is there's some sort of hunger for some kind of reality, some kind of basis of something. And yet the way that it is conceived of and the way that it gets kind of sold as this fundamentally modern vision of this self-controlling self who also controls others, the person who kind of a member of the lobster trad dominance evolutionary hierarchy, but is also the kind of the Nietzschean Superman at the same time, the person who stands outside of the world and shapes it. I suppose I have a degree of sympathy for a desire to recover a sense of reality in a world where things often do feel unreal or alienated for a variety of reasons. And yet what fascinates me is precisely the, you could do nothing less trad in a sense than try to make yourself via the sort of self-help techniques. And I do think, that's not to say there's not a place for personal discipline or virtue ethics or other kind of schools of thought are about the control of the self for a greater end. But a very important distinction between, say, reading the lives of the saints as a medieval person or hearing, and this is, what is that purpose? What is this all for at the end of the day? Does this fit into a wider moral vision? Or is this just about self-actualization and personal contentment and worldly success? And I think that difference is actually quite a big one.
Right. Well, we have kind of no choice but to think about, who we want to be and what we're going to make of ourselves to a certain extent. But, you have this really nice passage that I just want to read at the end, because I think it captures the kind of, your ultimate mixed verdict on this change, is that you say that the story of self-creation is, you're not arguing that it's straightforwardly tragic. And in fact, the promise offers the potential for genuine liberation. The early Americans called to self-cultivation, and the ideal that if we learn to govern ourselves emotionally, we can better govern ourselves politically, is and should remain an inspiring one. Our ability to create, to imagine, to dream better lives for ourselves and those around us, and our freedom to transform those dreams into social realities are among the most vital and human parts of ourselves. But the seemingly liberatory promise that we could create ourselves has, as often as not, been warped into an excuse to create implicitly or explicitly two classes of people: those who are capable of shaping their destinies and who thereby deserve their success, and those who are not and who deserve nothing. This classification invariably places those who do not fit the dominant physical or cultural mold, women, people of color, the poor, the disabled, in the second category. And as I was, preparing for my manfluencer's conversation, I was reading this, I was going, yes, that is the problem with the Jordan Petersonian self-making framework.
I mean, I think ultimately, if it's only for yourself, if it's not for anything, if you don't have a sense of the architecture of the universe sort of tending towards a collective wider moral purpose, I mean, what is left but the dominance hierarchies and the ability to wield power? And I think that what ends up happening with a lot of these figures, including like taking to the extreme visions of like Wildian dandyism, which, I have historically been a big fan of. But ultimately, that there is a certain nihilism in it, which comes from the sense that nothing means anything but what you make it. And so the shaping of perception in one's public image more broadly takes on something kind of different, because it's not lying. In this framework, I think it's lying. But in this moral framework, if reality is kind of completely fungible and kind of meaningless, and therefore reality is only what you make it, the real world is the network of perceptions, the latticed sort of social imaginary, which means creating yourself in a certain way is actually just shaping reality in your image. You are making truth because you are responsible for making reality. And you can, you find this in like Mussolini when he talks about shaping the crowd. He's the artist and there's the clay and he's kind of moving them with his fingers in a particular way. You find this in like the way that Donald Trump talks about the art of the deal, very influenced by Norman Vincent Peale and other practitioners of New Thought, this quintessentially American self-help tradition that's all basically proto-manifesting. Reality is what you make it. If you convince people of stuff, it becomes true. And in an era where more and more of us live online, almost 90% of Americans have smartphones, a lot of our shared reality is kind of social reality in that it's not physically embodied. Suddenly, massaging that reality is a lot easier. Like, it is a lot easier to do the meme magic than it was before the internet. And so increasingly, I think that this Selfmade and the work that I'm doing after Selfmade, it started out just as a history of self-creation, but I think it's also about reality creation, or about how we think of what is real and how we think of manipulating that reality and its reference to the capital R real out there.
Yeah, your book is historical for the most part, and people might approach it or think of it as a kind of critique of celebrity culture. But actually, my takeaway was, the things that I thought about most were fascism, Nazism, Donald Trump, because I've written a whole biography of Donald Trump at one point in my life, and it was so I've read everything he's ever put his name on. Not that he's written, because he's never written a book, but he's published a lot of books. And he has this philosophy that is basically, you want to be the top dog. Why? Never quite clear. But, there is no alternative. Your job is to try and crush everyone else, not to invoke the easy Nazi comparison, but I am struck by the similarities between that and the Hitlerian idea that, you build strength for its own sake. You build power for its own sake, for the sake of just becoming powerful. To what end? Is it to achieve the happiness, fulfillment, enlightenment? Not really. No, it's because you think that, your destiny is just to be extremely powerful and to maximally control your own destiny.
I do agree with you, but I think that one of the places that you can see this transition from the kind of dandy worship before we get all the way to Hitler, which I think is like a harder immediate sell, is looking at someone like Gabriele D'Annunzio, who, for unfamiliar readers, is considered a kind of proto-fascist military leader, but really he starts out as a dandy in the Wildian, Huysmanian mold. His first novel is basically about a young neurasthenic aristocrat and all this love problems and clothing that he likes to wear. He's a society journalist. He becomes a poet, but at a certain point, he starts getting both political and personal traction as this kind of prophet of basically erotic excitement through violence. Italy is still a very new country. He's advocating for Italian military intervention, first in Italian-speaking lands that are part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but also then in World War I. And so much of his political identity, and people are drawn to him, is that he is this prophet of this primal magical age where men were men and women were women, and we were all like Greek battle soldiers. He makes up this cry that he says is the cry of the Achilles and the Iliad, and it's not. He gets sort of people to do it. And after World War I, he basically, very long story short, becomes an 18-month dictator of a disputed Italian-speaking city in what is now Croatia, Rijeka in Croatia, known to him as Fiume. And he basically leads this military dictatorship because he's a celebrity and can get people to do what he wants. And he's, there's poetry readings and there's, fireworks every night. And it's this vision of a personality cult where he really has, and he writes about this in his novels, which are very influenced by Nietzsche, about the self who must become a god. And part of being a self who is a god is making these sheeple do your bidding. They are part of the artistic production. And the model that he sets is hugely influential to Mussolini, who is a big admirer of his, although D'Annunzio, I think people who want to defend D'Annunzio against being a proto-fascist do like to point out that he personally hated Mussolini and thought he was a dick. But, this vision of the Italian fascism does come directly out of D'Annunzian political Nietzscheanism. I won't call it fascism. I'll take the fifth for D'Annunzio. But definitely he is the inheritor of this 19th century aesthetic strain. He puts it into a political program, and that political program is influential. There is a direct lineage here.
Yes. Want to reach the conclusion that dandyism leads to fascism, but we have to be honest about our history. So let's see. Yeah, what you've just said there, just by the way, people should know that if they pick up this book, it is not just a book of ideas, but it is a book of extremely fun historical anecdotes that you have found, and you will introduce people to characters that they didn't know about or things that they didn't know about people they did know about, like Thomas Edison. Maybe we could, in this last part here, just go through a couple of the examples, because each chapter you kind of move through time and take a case study. I had never seen, until I read your book, and I keep forgetting the guy's name who made the portrait of himself looking like Jesus.
Oh, Albrecht Dürer.
And I looked up the painting, and it's so totally fascinating as a turning point. Because if we're talking about the history of people coming to view themselves as gods, is this the first moment where a guy paints himself as God?
I believe that it is. It's not just the first self-portrait. It's not the first self-portrait, but it's the first self-portrait where the personality of the artist is highlighted in a particular way, which is to say the sort of tradition, if you were going to paint yourself as an artist, which already is relatively new. The medieval artist traditionally is the anonymous artisan working for the glory of God, to create a wider whole. But you might at most paint yourself as a background character in a religious scene. Jesus is being crucified and there's a bunch of sad worshipers and one of them looks a little bit like you. There is precedent for that. But the idea of sort of painting yourself as a worthy subject And especially when in Durer's 1500 painting, he's facing the viewer. He's got his hand up in a kind of reference to evocation of the traditional way that Jesus in iconography would raise his hand. There's a sort of AD for Albrecht Dürer that also hints at it's 1500 AD Anno Domini. So there's this kind of real vision that the artist is a kind of divine being. And that ties into a wider Renaissance trend, which is this kind of theorization of genius in a very particular way, or theorization of this certain, basically what I would call a self-maker, understood as a kind of demigod, that there are some people who are real live, like blood aristocrats. There's some people who are just whatever, they're peasants. But then there's a kind of person, it's the genius. It's often referred to as the true noble, or someone who has true nobility, someone whose personal qualities, their genius, their intellect, their moral qualities make them a kind of, they earn a certain kind of aristocracy. It's sort of like they're the exception that proves the rule. The way that they get theorized or understood is as rhetorically, though not literally, demigods. They're basically like bastard children. And of course, people like many of these geniuses, like Da Vinci, literally were bastards. But the way a lot of the language is very like, well, like, okay, so technically his father is so-and-so, but really his father is God. Really his father is nature, the true parent, the true author. These people have some kind of direct and unmediated relationship with either the divine or nature, and it's sort of Renaissance Neoplatonic language. It's not very programmatic. There's a lot of like the goddess fortune, but also the goddess nature, but also God. Rhetorically, it is quite slippery. But the thing that is consistent is this idea that the bastard has an unmediated, or the metaphorical bastard has the unmediated relationship with God and nature that his legitimate, normal, rhetorical brother doesn't. The most famous example of this is actually not in Renaissance Italy, but around the same time in Shakespeare's King Lear. Edmund, the bastard of the two children of the Earl of Gloucester, has this incredible soliloquy about like stand up for bastards. And he says sort of his bastardy is that he is born out of lust, out of desire, whereas his legitimate brother is born out of custom and duty. He is born in a boring marital bed, got tween asleep and awake, is the way he like dismissively refers to his brother's conception. Whereas he is the like child of nature, but also he's the child of desire because he's illegitimate. And this image of the self-maker, the bastard, as the person who creates his own destiny through being a child of desire, as opposed to the custom child, is a kind of a model for all of the self-making tradition. Like Edmund is the bastard of all self-makers.
And when you say there, the image of the self-maker, I feel like image is so important to all of this, because you are not just tracing a phenomenon in which people come to believe that they are and ought to be in control of their destinies and act accordingly. You are also tracing the rise of a particular kind of picture of themselves that people want to leave in the minds of others around them. So a lot of the self-makers in the history of the self-made man and the influencer are not really self-made, but they are very, very skilled. I feel like you've mentioned Elon Musk here. Very, very skilled in creating the picture of the great genius.
Absolutely. And I think this is something that we find both in the kind of dandy European strain and in the American hard work strain. Like for every, Horatio Alger narrative of bootstrapping your way to the top, you have a P.T. Barnum, you have an all-American hoaxer who realizes that people want a little bit of humbug and enjoy being fooled. Ultimately, something that kind of becomes part of both the American and European narratives of self-making is this idea that the smart, canny person can create his own reality. And again, there's this figure of the con artist, the hoaxer, P.T. Barnum writing about humbug, but also there's a novel called Vivian Grey from the Regency era, which was written pseudonymously. published in 1826. And it's the story of a kind of Beau Brummel-esque dandy, but who has a sneer for the world, which basically he's has contempt for everyone around him. He has no morality. And it's basically like a proto-House of Cards. He lies and cheats and steals his way as he tries to advance socially. And what I find is hilarious is it is actually written under a pseudonym by Benjamin Disraeli, who would go on to become prime minister. And before he goes into politics, he is, deeply aware of being a kind of outsider in a certain way because he's Jewish. But he envisions in this novel that becomes hugely scandalous, the self-maker as someone who can make society in his image, where morality is secondary to being able to massage public opinion. And while it's obviously a satirical book, it is not to be taken too seriously, it is, I think, a testament to this awareness that because everything rests on perception, part of self-making as this tradition of determining one's own destiny involves shaping public perception, even if it's quote unquote false.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me conclude here by asking you, are we trapped? Is this unavoidable? Has the mixture of Darwinism, Nietzsche, the abandonment or the loss of faith, the rise of social media created a kind of toxic brew from which we will never escape? Or do you think in our own time we can free ourselves? As you say, there are things that we don't want to necessarily sacrifice about this view that we can and should become who we want to be, and that we as humans deserve to be free to have fulfilling lives and to have personal aspirations, but without drifting into this view that the greatest good of all is to not be made at all by your society or surroundings or by nature, and to do all of the making yourselves as a god on earth.
So I think we're probably pretty trapped. Like, I'm not overly optimistic, but I do think that particularly for generations who have grown up on social media, I think we will see a more defined movement or subculture of people, Zoomers and younger, who, having grown up basically like as content for their parents who are extremely online, will desire to move away from it. And I don't know if, like, socially speaking, we can be like, it is very hard to not be on social media, even in terms of like living your life. It's very hard not to walk around with a smartphone in your hand because you'll need to scan it here and scan it there. But I think we will see a significant, but perhaps not culture shaping minority of people making the active, intentional decision to avoid that social media life as much as possible as a commitment.
Well, you must feel this, because I feel it. You and I are both, I guess we're public intellectuals for a living in a certain sense. And you must feel this pressure to package and brand yourself. And obviously publishers now buy the author just as much as they buy the ideas in their book. And, when you do a book proposal, you have to go like, this is my Instagram account and this is my marketing strategy. And it horrifies and disturbs me because I have to try and create a sellable identity in order to have a career.
I hate it. I mean, I like coming on podcasts. I'm enjoying talking to you very much. I like that part. And I actually think nonfiction is a little bit better in that regard, because you still can talk about ideas in a way that I think for fiction, my sense is that it's even more about your personality, just from my own experience trying to promote both. But I always say I'll know that I've truly made it. Like, my mental conception of making it is when I cannot have any public facing social media.
Yeah.
Like, when I can be offline. When I'm one of those people, those like eminent older writers who you have to write them by snail mail, and perhaps their secretary will forward the letter. Like, for me, that is what success is. Like, a certain kind of privacy or not self-branding feels like a luxury good for an aspirational stage in my career.
Yeah, well, that's why I feel like the ideal author is like Elena Ferrante, where it's like, if you can get it so that people will have to just appreciate the text and they're not allowed to know anything about the author, it can't factor into their thoughts. Oh, how nice that would be.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, the book is so packed with fantastic stories. We didn't even cover Beau Brummel, who I was just totally fascinated by. You've written Thomas Edison. People should read your article as well in Current Affairs about, because you start with him. Frederick Douglass is in the book. It's a wild ride through 500 years of history very quickly, but with a lot of depth and richness. People need to pick up Tara Isabella Burton's new book, Selfmade, Creating Our Identities from Da Vinci to the Kardashians. And you can also listen to the previous conversation that we had about her previous book, Strange Rites, New Religions for a Godless World. Tara Isabella Burton, thank you so much for joining me today on Current Affairs.
Thank you for having me.
The Current Affairs Podcast is a product of Current Affairs Magazine. If you are not subscribed to Current Affairs Magazine, visit currentaffairs.org/subscribe today and get our glorious print edition. The Current Affairs Podcast is released regularly every week on patreon.com/currentaffairs. Thanks for listening.